This is the NIDD Hall portrait, and debate has raged for decades over who the woman it depicts was. Is it Henry VIII's second wife, Anne Boleyn, as the AB brooch on her dress suggests, or is it his third, Jane Seymour? In today's video from History Calling, we're going to look at what we know about this image, at why the sitter's identity remains so controversial, and at what facial recognition software used on it in 2015 did and didn't tell us about it. The NIDD Hall portrait takes its name from the fact that it belongs to the Mountgarrett family, whose family seat was NIDD Hall. It depicts a Tudor-era woman shown from about the waist up and turned slightly to her right. She is wearing a black dress with a square-cut neckline, and her white chemise is showing around the edges of that neckline. We can see the beginnings of large, flared sleeves, which are gold or brown in colour. Her headdress is an English gable-style hood, which is red in colour around the face, with a black veil pinned up on the right side of her head. The white lappets of the hood are studded with pearls and flick out at a point in between the sitter's lip and chin level. On top of the dress are three long strands of pearls, which drape over the woman's shoulders and down below her bust. Suspended from the top centre of the dress is a golden brooch in the shape of the letters AB, and with a single pearl hanging from its base. Around her neck is a necklace comprising sets of 4 pearls, alternating with rubies set in gold. It is arranged as a choker, with 2 chain sections dropping down the front of her chest and disappearing into the neckline of her dress. Suspended from the choker is a pendant, which contains 3 stones, 1 on top, 2 on the bottom. Like the brooch, it has a pearl hanging from its base. The woman appears to have brown eyes. It's difficult to be sure, but I'm afraid this is the best quality image I could find of the portrait, and though we can't see her hair, her eyebrows appear either brown or dark blonde. She has a long nose, and we can see shadowing underneath her eyes and nasal labial folds between her nose and lips, indicating that she is not in the first flower of youth. So why has this portrait been identified as Anne? The most obvious answer is the brooch. AB are Anne Boleyn's initials, and she is generally associated with initial jewellery due to the very famous B pattern portraits we've all seen of her, so named because she wears a B pendant in them. See my video on that necklace to hear more about it. The necklace worn in the NIDD Hall portrait, though, is unmistakably the Tudor consort necklace, seen around the necks of 4 of Henry VIII's wives, including Anne, who sported it in the one and only confirmed contemporary image we have of her, which is a damaged portrait medal created in 1534, and which bears her motto, "The Most Happy." It is now held by the British Museum. She wore a cross pendant with it in that image, but the pendant we see in the NIDD Hall portrait appears in another of wife number 6, Catherine Parr. Again, if you want to know more about the consort necklace, I have an entire video on that too, which I'll also link on screen and below for you. Finally, we have this engraving, made by Renold Elstrack and published in 1618 by Henry Holland, in a book called Baziliwlogia, which I'm sure I've mispronounced. This engraving is identified in the text around its rim, as well as in additional text written below it, as being Anne, and there are some definite similarities between it and the NIDD Hall picture. Both show a Tudor woman turned slightly to her right, wearing a gable hood decorated with pearls, and with strings of pearls draped from her shoulders to beneath her bust. There are some very noticeable differences too, though, particularly her necklace and brooch and the position of her hands. But I'm no art historian, and scholars of Anne's life and iconography, including Eric Ives and Roy Strong, have written that the engraving is of the same pattern as the portrait, so let's just roll with that, despite my personal misgivings. In both the case of the portrait and the engraving, The theory goes that this is Anne towards the end of her life, as she looks so much older than in the B pattern images. Those arguing for Anne being the woman in the portrait also seemingly got a huge boost in 2015 when numerous media outlets reported that researchers in California had used facial recognition software to compare the NIDD Hall image to the 1534 portrait medal, and they were apparently a match. Things weren't all that they seemed though, and we'll be returning to that story a little later in the video. Before I provide the counter-arguments to the theory that the NIDD Hall portrait shows Anne, if you're enjoying this content, please take a moment to give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel with the notification bell switched on so that YouTube lets you know each time I upload. For more from History Calling, you can also find me on Patreon, where I share bonus material including early access to ad-free videos, mini podcasts and blog posts. In addition, I have an Amazon storefront where I've gathered together some recommendations for history-themed books, TV shows, movies, and more. Both are linked in the description box below for you, as is my Instagram account. Now let's turn to the arguments against an identification of Anne. The presence of the AB brooch seems to be a slam-dunk piece of evidence in favour of her, but perhaps it was added later on to create or bolster an association with her. As for her known love of initial jewellery, which we are aware of not just from her B pendant, but also from written records of her belongings, that means very little. Wearing letters was popular then, just as it is now, and Jane Seymour can be seen doing the same thing in her portraiture, as can Anne's daughter Elizabeth, who sported an A pendant in her first surviving portrait, which many take to be a reference to her mother. As for the consort necklace, while Anne owned and wore it, so did her successors, meaning that while its presence is a good indication that we're looking at one of Henry's wives, it doesn't necessarily mean that the sitter is Anne. A big problem with the identification of Anne is that this woman really doesn't resemble the Queen as we know her from the B pattern portraits, and I don't think we can put that down to the ageing process. Anne only became famous during the final 10 years of her life, her mid-20s to her mid-30s, and her B pattern portraits, which are all copies of a presumed lost original, look like they are presenting her during that period of her life. It's pretty unlikely she had an expensive portrait done before that, for she was a lady-in-waiting at the French court until the end of 1521 or the start of 1522, and the Hever Castle rose portrait shows her holding a red rose to symbolise Henry VIII's descent from the House of Lancaster. There would have been no reason for her to have posed with such a prop earlier in her life, before he took an interest in her. It seems quite a stretch, to me at least, and I realise this is subjective, to think that she went from fresh-faced B-pattern portrait to rather worn-out looking NIDD Hall portrait this quickly. You could argue that perhaps the B patterns aren't actually Anne, while the NIDD Hall image is, but the B patterns match up with a tiny portrait which I and many others believe to be her. This appears in a ring known as the Chequers ring, once owned by her daughter Elizabeth I, and most likely dating to the 1570s, when Anne was still within living memory. The high cheekbones and oval face we see in the likes of the Hever Rose portrait also align with what we see in the portrait medal, so I consider the B patterns to be as good a likeness as we're probably ever going to get of Anne, as they sync with images which were accepted as being her by those who would have known her. The NIDD Hall portrait may not be particularly convincing as Anne, but someone it does resemble is Jane Seymour. Admittedly, this woman looks a little too old to be Henry's third queen, who died at the age of about 28 or 29, but then again, her famous solo portrait by Tudor court painter Hans Holbein doesn't show her to have been any great beauty, so perhaps this is just an even less flattering but more realistic depiction, or it's a poor copy of a more flattering original. As for that supposed facial recognition match between the NIDD Hall image and the medal, the researchers in that case have gone on record as stating that the media seriously exaggerated their findings. When they eventually published their work in 2018, which looked at a whole host of pictures by the way, They gave Anne only one tiny paragraph, which is so short that I'm going to read it out in its entirety to you. It says, "The results of FACES, which is the acronym for their research project, are only as dependable as the images tested, and some paradigms gave seemingly undependable results. In a paradigm in which we tested the only known portrait, in inverted commas, of Anne Boleyn, the most happy medal, the results were such as to suggest that the test image itself did not provide sufficient portrait data for a reliable test." So the medal, which is tiny and has a damaged, squashed nose, wasn't even suitable for digital analysis, never mind matching the NIDD HALL portrait. This whole story was massively overblown and should not be considered any further in a discussion of the identity of the NIDD HALL sitter. By the by, while we're on the subject, can I just say that I disagree with trying to use portraits for facial analysis anyway, as they are too subjective. That's why, to give just one example, you can see such differences in the quality of the B pattern portraits. They're all ultimately copies of the same original, but look at how different they are. If not for the identical clothing, you wouldn't even know that a lot of them are meant to show the same woman. I know there's a trend on social media at the moment to take old portraits and modernise them to show what people would quote-unquote really look like, but the entire practice is built on very shaky foundations. The people posting these updated images, with Anne Boleyn in 21st century clothing and sporting beach waves, for example, are assuming that the portraits they've based their work on are photo accurate, and there's just no way to know that, and often every reason to doubt it. It's not only the NIDD HALL painting which looks more like Jane. The 1618 engraving, which is supposedly following the same pattern as it, may be called Anne Boleyn, but it is almost certainly a copy of a portrait which is indisputably Henry VIII's third wife. This is the Whitehall mural, a huge painting of Henry, his parents, and Jane, which was also executed by Hans Holbein. The original was lost to fire in 1698, but it survives in copies such as this one, and when we zoom in on Jane, the similarities between how she is presented here and the Elstrack engraving are striking. The jewellery and the general pose, except the position of the hands, match. So if the engraving actually comes from the Whitehall mural, then what does that say about the NIDD HALL portrait? If it really is following the same pattern as those other two images, does that mean it's of Jane? Furthermore, what came first, the engraving or the NIDD HALL image? Without dendrochronology testing to date the wooden panel I assume the NIDD HALL portrait is painted on, we can't be sure, and to the best of my knowledge, no such testing has ever been undertaken. If the engraving is actually of Jane, as it seems to be, that also leads to the question, why would someone copy a portrait of her and label it as Anne? The answer probably lies in the dearth of images available of Anne in the later 16th and early 17th centuries. The Whitehall mural, which was still in existence at the time the Elstrack engraving was undertaken, would have been in a much more public setting, a major royal palace through which thousands of people passed all the time, than many of the B pattern portraits we know today, which were likely in private collections. And if you're wondering why I say likely, it's because we can't trace their provenance much of the time. However, once Anne became more popular again, in and after the reign of her daughter, there would have been a demand for pictures of her, and to fulfill said demand, Elstrack may have just used a picture of Jane to which he had access as the basis for his work, and banked on his audience not knowing the difference. Alternatively, he may have made a genuine mistake and actually thought the Whitehall mural showed Anne. Writer Roland Hugh, in an article on his website, which I'll link below for you, posits that the engraving and the NIDD HALL painting both show Jane, and suggests that the engraving was most likely derived from a NIDD HALL type panel which misidentified the sitter as Anne Boleyn. Elstrack may have simply copied it as such in ignorance of the picture's actual source. We'll never know whether the error originated with Elstrack or someone else, but the text underneath the engraving incorrectly gives Anne's year of death as 1535 instead of 1536, so clearly he wasn't double-checking his information very well. Now you might think that deliberately fabricating a picture of Anne, one of history's most famous women, sounds daft, but bear in mind that people, some of whom even claim to be qualified historians, do similar things today. We don't have any pictures of Anne's brother George or his wife Jane Parker, for instance, and yet despite the mountain of evidence showing that these images do not depict those two people, you'll still see them being used in books and TV shows about them all the time. It's annoying, yes, but on the upside, these blatant lies did give me 2 videos worth of content as I debunked those theories, so I suppose that's something. I'll leave said videos linked below for you so that you can check them out at your leisure. Of course, some of our questions about the NIDD Hall portrait could be resolved if only it was subjected to some modern testing. As I've already mentioned, dendrochronology could perhaps establish how old the board it's painted on is, telling us if it's 16th century or later, while X-ray and paint analysis might establish if there's any extra information not available to the naked eye, such as a different brooch or evidence that the brooch was added later. I couldn't find a description of its provenance either. It's now owned by the Mountgarrett family and held at Bradford art galleries and museums, but how long has the family had it and how far back can it reliably be traced? One of the big problems with talking about this image is that we're missing so much valuable information about its composition and history, and that limits the answers that I or anyone else can give you about its past and its sitter. In short, more research is needed, and I hope that this portrait gets it. So to conclude, there is significant evidence that the NIDD Hall portrait and the 1618 Elstrack engraving associated with it are actually based on the Whitehall mural of Jane Seymour and have been misidentified as Anne Boleyn, but much more work is needed to be able to give a more positive assessment of who the painting's sitter was. On the basis of what I have been able to tell you today though, what do you think? Is this Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, or some completely unknown woman? Let me know your opinions below, and if you want more Tudor history, try one of these videos next. Whatever you choose, please enjoy, and until next time, keep learning.